Welcome to a new year, 2021, and this edition of IBFD's Tax Takes News and Views. Because of our 3-week holiday hiatus, today we bring you the month's tax news in a nutshell. I'm Stuart Gibson, IBFD's Chief Editor, Global News in Washington, D.C. With me for our Beyond the News interview is Barry Larking, Special Counsel at IBFD in Amsterdam. On today's show, the United States survives a coup attempt, while Democrats win 2 U.S. Senate races, giving them control of both houses of Congress. After a first and possibly last Trump veto override, will the U.S. soon lose its appeal as an international tax haven? And why British women could be the first beneficiaries of Brexit. These and more, including Barry Larking's interview with Serena von Kalmer, Global Head of Knowledge International Tax at DLA Piper in Amsterdam, coming up on IBFD's Tax Take. I record this news report just 48 hours after a violent armed mob stormed the United States Capitol building in Washington as Congress met to certify the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as the next president and vice president of the United States. After 4 hours, 5 deaths, and scores of injuries to Capitol police officers, order was restored. And in the small hours of Thursday, January 7, Congress formally certified Biden and Harris as the next U.S. president and vice president. The day before that, voters in Georgia delivered a huge victory to Democrats in 2 U.S. Senate runoff elections. That win will enable Democrats to take control of both houses of Congress after Harris is sworn in on January 20th. They will then have the power to help Joe Biden deliver on some aspects of the aggressive tax agenda he campaigned on. Watch this space. Turning to the top news of the past month, as reported in IBFD's Tax News Service. The United States' claim to be a champion of tax transparency was sorely tested in April 2016 after journalists published the Panama Papers. Those leaked documents detailed how a Panamanian law firm helped its clients take advantage of anonymous U.S. shell companies to launder money and hide from tax authorities around the world. After that, the world's focus began to shift from familiar tax havens like Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands, and Switzerland to obscure U.S. states like Nevada, Wyoming, and Delaware, where anyone could set up a corporation or LLC and keep their identity hidden from the world. Well, those days are about to end, all by way of a strange series of events. Last month, Congress tucked something called the Corporate Transparency Act into a multi-thousand-page bill to fund the U.S. Defense Department. That act would require corporations and limited liability companies to disclose their beneficial owners to the Treasury. Late last month, President Trump vetoed the bill for reasons having nothing to do with this issue. But in late December and early January, Congress mustered the 2/3 majority votes necessary to override the veto, the first and perhaps only veto override of his presidency. Bottom line, soon after Treasury adopts implementing regulations required by next January, U.S. anonymous shell companies will be a thing of the past. The European Union has long been criticized for its VAT directive that classifies feminine hygiene products as luxury goods subject to value-added tax. Critics argue that the directive imposes an unfair tax on products that are necessities, not luxuries, discriminates against women on the basis of their gender, and inflicts a particularly harsh burden on families living in poverty. The backlash against this so-called tampon tax was so strong in the UK that in 2016, Parliament passed a bill eliminating the tax as soon as it became legal to do so. Well, that day came on January 1st, 2021, the first day that the UK was no longer a member of the European Union. And sure enough, the UK announced it would apply a 0% VAT rate to women's sanitary products starting that same day. Perhaps now the EU will finally follow the lead of its former member and eliminate this discriminatory levy. Turning to other news, speaking of Brexit, at the 11th hour, the EU and the UK reached an agreement in principle on tax and trade cooperation. But despite the last-minute agreement, confusion continues to reign throughout Europe to the extent that some EU member states refuse to allow British subjects to enter their country, even as transit passengers. Having left the European Union, the UK has now signed trade continuity agreements with a number of non-EU members. including Moldova, Ukraine, and South Korea, while EU members like Malta have adjusted their laws to reflect the new post-Brexit Europe. Some countries continue to offer economic and tax lifelines to people and businesses affected by the ongoing pandemic, while other countries offer tax incentives to encourage new businesses or new residents. In the former category are the United States, which passed a new long-debated COVID relief package, and Suriname, which postponed implementation of a 10% solidarity tax. The latter category includes San Marino, which has enacted a budget that offers significant tax incentives for people to move to that tiny country, Thailand, which has adopted additional tax incentives for investments in digital technology, and Uruguay, which now offers tax deductions for donations to finance the development of high-priced medicines. One thing the pandemic has not done is slow the proliferation of creative tax measures. For example, Pakistan will now allow 5% sales tax cash back to retail customers, hoping this will reduce the incidence of sales tax evasion. Belgium has proposed a new annual securities account tax, and Romania has introduced a new consolidated group regime starting this year. And finally, in a proposal that gives lawmakers something to crow about, the Philippines House of Representatives has approved legislation imposing taxes on online and on-site wagering on locally licensed cockfights. Now we go beyond the news for Barry Larking's interview with Serena von Kalmer of DLA Piper. Barry?
Thank you, Stuart, for your informative news report. I'm Barry Larking, Special Counsel here at IBFD, and I'm joined today by Serena von Kalmer, who is a Swiss tax lawyer based in Amsterdam and now the brand new Global Head of Knowledge International Tax at DLA Piper. Welcome, Serena. In this episode, we'll be taking a look back at the good, the bad, and maybe even the ugly stories in the world of tax from last year and what may be in store for 2021. Now, I don't think anybody would disagree that the COVID-19 crisis was one of the most ugly things coming out of 2020. But the crisis also had major implications for taxation. Serena, would you describe these as good, bad, or ugly?
First of all, thank you, Barry, for having me on. There is no doubt that the COVID-19 crisis is one of the most challenging crises the world economy has been facing in the modern history, with major implications on taxation. The speedy and the agile reaction of the governments, respectively tax administration, and of the international organizations, such as the OECD, can be definitely considered as a good aspect of this challenging crisis. While we know that tax changes to the tax legislation may take up like several years or even decades, we have seen in the last 9 to 10 months an unprecedented quick reaction of the governments and of the tax authorities to introduce a wide range of relief measures, enabling all actors of the economy to survive this crisis.
So it's been a good learning experience in that sense. I think everybody would or many people would agree with that. What about on the bad side?
Well, on the bad side, we know that the tax relief measures related in particular to tax compliance and tax collection, but they also addressed reduction of tax rates, so tax cuts. However, the question raises, will the governments be in the position to sustain those tax cuts, considering all the economic challenges countries will be facing in the near future?
Right. So in other words, it may be deferring the problem and actually making it worse by deferring it. And of course, we're already seeing countries that perhaps have realized that and are starting to cut back some of their reliefs, like I think Bolivia and Kenya have already started doing that. And what about on the ugly side, if we sort of move down the line?
Well, on the ugly side, I think we can point to the abuses that we saw in connection with those tax reliefs. Certainly, tax administration did not have all the capacities and resources to strictly control the implementation of the relief measures.
Right, which has basically opened the door to abuse. Yeah, and I guess also the speed of which these relief measures were introduced. On the one hand, it was a good thing, but on the other hand, it opened these possibilities.
Indeed, as we know, quick legislation can be superficial, can be inconsistent with the existing legislation, which creates loopholes.
Yeah, indeed. It's very often said, quick legislation is poor legislation. So you can't have everything, I suppose. Now, I guess if we were going to add embarrassing moments to our list of good, bad, and ugly, we would have to include the fact that the US government handed out apparently around $1 billion of COVID relief to dead people. Incidentally, that's not fake news. It does come from fairly official sources. So it can be pretty bizarre. If we go back to that abuse and loophole point, 2020 was supposed to be the year in which the EU's rules on mandatory disclosure of aggressive tax planning schemes were due to be implemented. Now, what happened?
Well, as we saw, most of the European member countries postponed the implementation of this legislation in the tax community known as the DAC 6 legislation, which is certainly positive as it gave more time to the whole tax community to accommodate the new legislation. The other side of the coin is that being preoccupied with the COVID-19 crisis, now when the deadline is reaching us, end of January, end of February, we still see quite some uncertainties, unclarities, how the legislation, how the hallmarks need to be interpreted. It is indeed challenging, not only for corporates and for the intermediaries, for tax advisors, but it will be also challenging for the tax administrations as they will be facing a record number of reporting, in particular in those member states which advocate an extensive interpretation of the reporting obligations.
So basically, it was a good thing that they postponed it, but lack of clarity raises problems, and it's going to be a busy time for tax administrations and tax advisors, of course, going forward.
Absolutely.
Right. The OECD last October published its long-awaited blueprints on global tax reform, the two pillars. How would you rate their progress or their that action?
Well, certainly that's a highlight of the 2020, let's say, tax developments in general. I believe that it is by itself an achievement of the work of the OECD that the organization was able to bring together more than 130 countries who have currently the proposals of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 on their tables. On the other side, the downside of it is that the member states were not in the position, were not able to reach consensus by the deadline. So there is no consensus at the moment. Of course, there may be like good reasons why this consensus could not be reached. I mean, member states were facing the COVID-19 crisis. We also see very different, major differences in the approach that member states would like to take. The question is when and how this consensus will be achieved.
Right. So you could say it's bad, but you could say it's not really the fault of the OECD or the inclusive framework. Things conspired, to use a topical word, against them. Yeah, and I mean, looking forward to the future, is it going to be an easy road, a downhill road to getting that consensus, do you think, during 2021?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it will be, I think this will preoccupy the tax community in 2021 and onward. It is also interesting to see the developments, on the political level. The question raises what will be the reaction of the United States of America on the unilateral digital service taxes already introduced or being in the pipeline to be introduced. I think it will be also interesting to see the reaction of the European Union itself, as we know that this matter has high priority on the EU's agenda. We know that the European Union has a so-called Plan B in case the OECD will not achieve a wide consensus. We also know that the UN is working on the amendment of the UN Model Tax Treaty in order to define the term of digital service tax. So I'm pretty sure that this topic, it will remain a high topic in 2021.
Right. I mean, from what you've said, there's a lot happening and going to happen in 2021. Just perhaps a sort of positive note on that. The US apparently has just announced that it will be deferring its trade barriers or tariffs that it was planning to impose on France. Not sort of permanently, but because they want to sort of consolidate their position. So maybe that's a positive point. I'm not sure. It depends how you look at it. Moving on, transfer pricing. I think quite a lot was happening in 2020. Can you give us a few highlights?
When it comes to the OECD publications, I would mention in particular the long-awaited publication on the COVID-19 implications on transfer pricing, which was published just a few weeks ago, as well as also the publication of the OECD beginning of 2020 regarding intragroup financing activities.
Right, right. Okay, so that's, I guess, a good thing. What about anything bad on the transfer pricing front?
Well, I think in respect of the financial transactions guidelines, I think the question raises how local domestic jurisdictions will implement the recommendations of the OECD and what will be the ultimate impact for multinationals, in particular their treasury activities. I think another highlight or lowlight in transfer pricing is the developments relating to Apple case. Mm-hmm. So the decision of the European General Court, whereby the European Commission lost its case, lost its Apple case, as it was not in the position, it did not succeed in showing the requisite legal standard that Apple indeed received taxation advantages from Ireland.
So that was bad, obviously, from the Commission's perspective. It was arguably good from Apple's perspective, but it was also perhaps bad in the sense that many people felt that they had a strong case. The Commission had a strong case. I guess that's also part of the story. What about, I mean, anything ugly about that case? Would you think, is that it? Is it a one-off?
Well, I think it is just a shame that we still, after so many years, have uncertainty in respect to state aid cases.
Right. I think that basically says it all. Something entirely different. The US elections, on the face of it, have nothing to do with taxation, but obviously indirectly, potentially a lot. Anything good, bad, or ugly about that?
Well, I think I will not go into the political aspects of the
Very sensible.
of the US elections. I do believe that from a tax point of view, it will be interesting to see what the approach of the Biden administration will be. And there is hope that there might be a more cooperative kind of way the US will want to take also in tax matters.
So that's obviously good.
Yes, that's good. The question raises whether any changes that were implemented by the US tax reform will be reversed, as even though the Biden administration may take up a different approach, I do not think that from a financial and economic perspective, they will have another interest than simply continuing to onshore and repatriate businesses from outside the US.
Right. So in that sense, it may be good for America, America first, if that policy continues, and that may sort of, on the other hand, be less good for the rest of the world. We will see. Finally, we get to the thing that actually did happen right at the end of the year, Brexit. And I don't think anybody needs to think about the question whether the process of Brexit was good, bad, or ugly. It was very much in the ugly category. But we now have a signed trade and cooperation agreement on the table. And I'm not expecting you to summarize all 1,500 pages, but is there anything that you can sort of pick out which you would say is particularly good, bad, or ugly from a tax perspective?
Definitely, it is good that the EU and UK were able to reach an agreement. So I think that's good from tax and other perspectives. I think bad is that there are a wide range of unanswered questions, in particular when it comes to the VAT implications of the Brexit for businesses, customs. We do not know how tax treaties will be
Impacted
by Brexit. And we also saw that, for example, in respect to DAC 6, UK moved on to a different approach, and just a very limited portion of this legislation will be implemented by UK, which again raises the questions, what will be the impact on businesses held by UK shareholders in respect of their reporting obligations?
Right, and I guess that development may well be, it's one item, but it may well be the writing on the wall going forward. So we may expect to see a lot more of that kind of development as the year moves on. Well, Serena, we've come to the end of our short overview. Our guest today has been Serena von Kommer, Global Head of Knowledge International Tax at DLA Piper. Thanks for reminding us of some of the tax highlights and lowlights of last year, and giving us some hope for better things to come in 2021. And that wraps up this week's edition of Tax Takes News and Views, the week's news in a nutshell. From Stuart Gibson and myself, thank you for watching, and here's hoping your week is not too taxing.